IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Ganatantra podcast. I am Sariyo Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And in this week's episode, we are joined by Nadika. Nadika is a trans-lesbian feminist and a writer and researcher with interests in history and archaeology, entertainment, and gender in the internet.
In this week's episode, we'll be talking to Nadja about the Transgender Bill, about the NALSA judgment, the transgender movement in India, and the interplay between marginalization and politics in this country. Welcome to the Ganatantra podcast, Nadika.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So let's start with a very quick introduction to the Transgender Bill. As it stands, this bill is currently pending in Parliament. It has been cleared by the Lok Sabha, if I'm not mistaken, and has to be passed by the Rajya Sabha. However, there are serious problems with the bill. There are issues about the process in which identification of transgender persons takes place. There is a sense that it has in some way diluted some of the rights the Supreme Court has guaranteed in its judgments. So, Nadika, if we can start with a little bit going more into depth about what are the specific problems with this bill. That even though this purports to be a social welfare legislation, there is a strong pushback from the transgender community about the provisions of this bill.
Let's start with a bit of a history. In 2014, the Supreme Court of India, in a case called NALSA versus Union of India, sort of went quite widespread to grant a bunch of rights to the trans community. One of the longest standing demands / political stance of the trans community has been that gender is self-determined. Gender does not come from external places. Gender does not come from a committee. And so the Supreme Court actually granted that much of a right. Said trans people can self-identify in any gender they want. It doesn't. It is not dependent on medical or surgical, changes and things like that. So the Supreme Court went quite for its time and for what was then the global trans movement. It was quite a progressive verdict. And we all had lots of cheer about it. Obviously, there were lots of other issues in the way the bill was also, the verdict was also framed. But, that it went that far and said gender is self-determined, you can identify as a man or a woman or transgender or as anything you want, was quite a lovely movement. And then the Supreme Court said the government has to pass an act based on this and then grant rights to trans people. And so that started the process of creating the Trans Bill. There were a couple of consultations with community leaders in 2013 and 2014. And the government changed in 2014. And then in 2016, they came out with a draft bill in which a lot of these things just fizzled away. The draft bill in 2016 sort of was working from a 1980s sort of rehabilitation perspective. It said, trans people are such poor, these people need rescuing and they need rehabilitation and we need to do something. We are such a benevolent government. We need to do this. We need to do that. Instead of saying, just go ahead and be who you are, want to be who you are and you all have the same rights as everybody else. And so we pushed back. There were a lot of comments and feedback that went to the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. There were consultations across cities in India, Chennai, Delhi, Bombay, and places like that. Communities came together, and we put forward a bunch of suggestions and amendments that we wanted for the bill, and that just didn't go anywhere. If anything, the bill that came later, the 2016 bill, was just complete, how do I say this in the most polite way possible, was a screw up, where the Supreme Court said self-determination of gender, the 2016 bill said you have to go present yourself in front of a committee to say that you're trans and get a trans certificate, and that committee will consist of a district magistrate, a medical officer, a surgeon, a doctor, and members from the community, and it basically created this whole gatekeeping organization that says who you are. That was one of the biggest issues. The Supreme Court said there must be affirmative action for trans people, there must be reservation and all that. And then there was completely nothing like that in the bill. There was no provisions for anti-discrimination. There was nothing like that. And then the very idea of what trans itself was completely misinterpreted and misrepresented in the 2016 bill. Instead of saying trans people are people who do not closely identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, it went off on to, they are this, they're neither male nor female, neither this nor that. It was all about not being normal. And obviously that was a big issue for us, and we all had lots of fights and representations to the government from Sampurna, which is the network I'm a big part of. I'm not a big part of it. I'm part of Sampurna, and we sort of do a lot of things with Sampurna. So we made depositions at front of the parliament, the standing committee, saying that this is wrong, this is not the way to go about it, and said please go back to NALSA, or even go back to 2014's Trichy Shiva bill. Trichy Shiva, the DMK MP from Trichy, had in 2014, immediately after NALSA, presented a private member's bill in the Rajya Sabha, which sought to give rights to trans people. And that bill was very, very, again, there are issues because it doesn't come from the community directly, and obviously no community can agree entirely on everything. But it was way better than what the government had come up with. The 2014 Trichy Shiva private bill was, much more inclusive in the term of what trans means, and sought a wider definition of what a family can be for trans people. A lot of, in India we have the Hijra family system, we have the Jamaats, we have the Havelis, we have things like that, right? And so these are families of choice for trans people, because trans people and gender non-conforming kids face a lot of discrimination, a lot of violence at their birth homes. And so the idea of what a family means was much more liberal and more open and more inclusive in the Trichy Shiva bill, whereas in the government bill of 2016, the family was just seen as a natal family, and it had rules, it had provisions like nobody can take the trans child away from the family, which is a huge potential for violence and give all stories of shock therapy and conversion therapy and things like that. So these were the big issues with the TG bill, and there were many representations from many communities and networks to the government on what the problem with the bill was and why. I'll just go back. So there are many representations from different communities and different networks on what the problem with the bill was, right? And so it was passed to the standing committee for their recommendations. The standing committee invited a few people to depose in front of them. We all went and gave our feedback. Then the standing committee came back with lots of changes and amendments to the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, who said, sorry, we can't do this. And we said, we were led to believe that we had a bill presented in the Parliament in 2000, late 2018, and there were so many times that the bill was supposed to be presented in Parliament. It was listed on the business for about 27 days of the winter session, and it didn't come up at all. And then we got, the government, the Lok Sabha would be dissolved, and that means the bill would lapse, and there would be a new version of the bill coming up, and that gave us some sort of, false hope maybe, of, okay, maybe they'll go back and then they'll redo it, and then August rolled by, and Section 3 was abrogated, and then under the radar of all that, they snuck this bill back in, and there was essentially the same bill. They removed one or two major issues, but retained the whole thing. Yeah.
So just so that we sort of understand, in the sense that what rights that the Supreme Court said are essentially constitutional rights of transgender persons, of self-identity, of being able to choose their gender, this bill essentially waters down.
Yes.
It is a huge step down in terms of how the Supreme Court recognized these rights as fundamental rights of transgender persons.
Yeah, that's true. And that's sort of like, we've seen this in many other incidences, especially with the right to privacy and all that. There was that, sort of landmark judgment a little while ago, but that didn't translate to anything on the ground, obviously, in terms of privacy and things like that. So basically, the Constitution grants us these rights, and then there are layers on top of that essentially negate those rights. And then the NALSA tried to remove some of those layers, and the STG bill is putting them all back now.
Right. And it's sort of interesting. And for me as a lawyer, and at least keeping track of the developments in India and other countries in the world, we seem to be one of the first few countries in the world where trans rights were recognized by court before the rights of the lesbian, gay community. In a sense of most places, it's been the other way around, but in India, it seems to have happened in the other way around. Much before. I'm wondering if that is a function of maybe better organization, greater visibility. Any thoughts you have on this?
Obviously, even much before NALSA, much before the Supreme Court in 2014, we had the Jacqueline Mary case in Tamil Nadu in late 2007, early 2008, I think, which came down very heavily. The Madras High Court came down very heavily on the DMK government at that time, and that sort of sparked the creation of the first ever transgender welfare board in the world, maybe. But definitely in India. And so Tamil Nadu had the first ever transgender welfare board back in 2008. And that was a demand by one of the alliance partners of DMK at that point of time, the VCK, Viduthalai Chiruthaigal Katsi Mavalans party, right? And from there, the DMK government sort of expanded rights, and so there were lots of other things that went on there. And so Tamil Nadu was seen as a more progressive state for trans rights. But like you said, that obviously comes from a little bit from judicial action, maybe judicial oversight of the executive. But there are lots of historical reasons for that also, because obviously we all like to say, oh, India has always recognized trans people, and we point to the hijras and we point to trans people everywhere, and we say, oh, we've been very accepting and all that. But obviously that's fantastic as PR for the country outside. It doesn't translate into any kind of social action on the ground. So the trans people have fought for a lot of these rights, but that also some of those fights came from, to put it very bluntly, it comes from the fight for HIV. Yeah, so there was a lot of HIV, money that went into the HIV fight, and that money trickles down in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s into NGOs that were working with what is called the MSMTG, which is the MSMTG, which is men having sex with men, and TG, transgenders. Yeah, so this is the high risk group that the HIV people have identified and said, okay, we must target them for intervention and for preventing and all those things.
Transgenders.
Right. So that is
and this is also similar or resonates with some of the conversations in different parts of the world around the HIV movement. Transgenders.
Right. Yes and no, a little bit for sure, but that there's a lot of white bias there, obviously. Us poor third world brown people are more at risk than educated white people, obviously. So a lot of that money came to India. And so that led to the NGOization of the trans community in India. And because there's an NGOization and there's money, there's also visibility of some kind in the law, in front of law. And then visibility to the system and to the government and things like that. So that has that some of that is at the back of this. What you say is that the court's oversight of trans rights. Right. Obviously, it's a simplistic explanation. There's a lot more going on. Obviously, trans people have organized much before the larger queer community. Trans people have sought a government intervention for rights and for protection and rehabilitation and anti-discrimination before the queer community did. But some of it obviously is coming from HIV money. Some of it is coming from some kind of historical perspective of India's always been trans friendly, and some of it is actually trans communities organizing themselves for the sake of organizing themselves.
Well, that's interesting to think about, sort of the different trajectories that have led us to the current juncture. But one thing we would also sort of like to probe, when you bring up this question of queer communities and some of the issues that are discussed within the queer community, is there a schism or a sort of difference within the way these movements or these vocabularies are built and imagined? And is it because of the way 377 was and the context within which those debates arose? It would be wonderful to understand some of the history behind the movement itself, the sort of various strands of the movement, and how these speak to various identities.
And let me just fill a little bit of context for listeners also. The NAS Foundation case, which Supreme Court overturned the Delhi High Court judgment striking down 377, actually did start also in the context of AIDS. NAS Foundation was working on the issue of men who have sex with men, and they've said that this prevents us from helping men who have AIDS because they don't want to come forward and come out in this respect. And that case, of course, followed its own trajectory. And some of what Nadika just said about the transit probably could also apply to this. But it would be, I suppose, just to take off from, go back to Saryu's question, in terms of the queer community and the transgender community, how do we see the interrelation between the two? Is one just part of the other, or feeding into the other, or something quite different from the other?
There's a lot of back and forth of the community, and lots of friction and a lot of co-option also. Mm-hmm. Again, if you go back far enough back in history, with the global queer movement sort of but it's the biggest flashpoint is the 1969 Stonewall riots, right? For those who may not know, Stonewall was this bar in New York, which is sort of frequented by the members of the queer community, largely trans people, largely gay men, a few gay women, and trans people who were, at the time that the word was not transgender, there were lots of other terms for describing it, including cross-dressers and transvestites and transsexuals and things like that, right? So there was a very mixed community of queer people frequenting this bar in New York called the Stonewall. And then there was a severe series of police raids at that because the government obviously didn't like these strange, weird people meeting in one place. And one of the police raids led to fight back from the queer community, including trans women of color, Marsha Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and other people who fought back. And the following year, at the same time in June, they had the first Pride March, and that sort of sparks the global queer pride movement. So, in a sense, the queer community exists because of trans people. But then what's happened in India is that because there is some historical evidence for queer attraction and queer behavior and queerness, right? It's not that there was not that big a flashpoint till the late 90s. In a sense, like you said, NAS Foundation. So there's a lot of action for organizing the what is called the MSM segment. And then the women's movement, the women's liberation movement, the feminist movement is sort of also starting to incorporate queer women into that fold. But there's still a lot of there is some some alienation of the trans community in the larger queer movement.
So what does this alienation sort of, I mean, how does it expressed and how
what does it translate into in terms of some of the big themes of the movements, or in terms of the way vocabularies are framed?
Yeah.
For instance, if you say, okay, I'm a queer woman group, right? Let's say there's a feminist group in, let's say, a major metro city, and then they understand that queer women are also feminists at some level, or queer women, lesbians and bisexual women are also, feminists or whatever. So they may expand the scope of the group to talk to them and fight for their rights.
Yeah.
But when a trans woman wants to approach it in the same, I am also a queer woman, trans women are not seen as women in the context, and the space is closed off for trans women to access. Right. Okay. So in the eyes of the feminist movement in the mid to late 90s, trans women aren't women. They are clubbed with the men.
Okay. Oh, so yes. So in terms of it creates boundaries and sort of exclusions and inclusions as to who belongs to what.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, I mean, it's not all of them, and it's all those disclaimers apply here. Terms and conditions. It's not all of them. It's not white. It's not intentional or whatever it is. But then these things happen, right? And so the queer movement is seen as largely a middle class elite, upper class, upper and middle class and upper caste thing,
right?
And the trans movement is obviously seen as working class.
Yeah.
I think that is a very interesting way, and kind of puts us also into the next point of where we sort of want to move on the discussion,
which is around intersectionality.
Yeah,
and sort of the idea of intersectional marginalities, right? Which is in terms of the overlaps between other identities, whether ascribed or otherwise, like caste or religion, which might intersect with say a trans identity, and the way in which that sort of impacts the conversations within the movement and even externally.
Yeah. So, like I said, the larger trans community in India, at least as far as I know, maybe in the south, maybe not so much in the north, is largely Dalit or OBC, right? And I'm one of the few privileged middle class, upper caste, Brahmin trans persons. I mean, it's not. I won't say I'm one of the few. There are obviously transness does not look at those things, but to a certain extent, somebody who comes from a privileged background may not get too much into activism.
Yeah.
And so it was always left to the working class and the Dalit and the OBC,
right?
Trans women largely to fight for these rights, because it's not just a question of identity; it's also a question of survival. And then we see some of those fights being co-opted by the middle class, upper caste elite queer movement in later periods. And then there's a lot of back and forth and give and take. And then largely now we have a queer movement that understands trans rights are human rights and things like that. And will say that and hold placards and go for marches and fights and things like that. But yes, so there was that friction earlier on, and that's sort of slowly, very, very slowly moving away in certain places.
And that also, I suppose, and this is a very thing that I suppose feeds into the debate about the transgender bill itself, in a sense that given the social base of the movement, and as you described it, at least in South India, largely Dalit and OBC, the demands were framed not just, say, purely civil political, but the classic definition. A lot of people don't agree with that definition, but as a helpful, by the way, we can say recognition would be civil political, say something like that. Decriminalization would be probably would be civil political, but also the socio-economic. Right? The more the demands which sort of go into the sense of questions of livelihood, go into the questions of individual security, go into the questions of probably integration with society, of being able to have jobs and non-discrimination and so on. I guess that also sort of translates into the way in which the criticisms of the bill are on all these fronts. Not to say that it's exclusively one thing or the other, but the criticism of the bill is sort of on all these counts. And I guess, and that's the point that was sort of made, that it has to do also with the social base of this movement, which is very different from, say, the larger queer movement.
Yeah, that's right. And if you see, that's been one of the biggest criticisms against the bill.
Okay.
Is that where is the comprehensive anti-discrimination? Where is the comprehensive reservation in education, employment, and healthcare? Where is the understanding that begging or sex work, which are considered the traditional occupations of trans people, is not because trans people like to do this, but there's no other option.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Where is that opening up of employment opportunities? Where is that reservation in education that lets trans people, oftentimes coming from the poorest segments of society, who've got to necessarily leave home because of various reasons, including violence from the natal family? How do you ensure that roti kapra makan? Right? Where is that? So that's been one of the biggest criticisms of the bill, that you're not doing any of these things, and you're just saying, no one can discriminate against trans people. But then how do you, if a definition doesn't exist, then the law it's invisible to the law. Right? If you don't define discrimination as this, then how do you present a case to the police? How do you present a case to the courts? How do you present a case to the government?
Absolutely.
Exactly. So, and then on top of that, we have it's very, very superficial, fuddy-duddy sort of, whosoever does this will be given 6 months prison or 2,000 rupee fine, which is like, we have somebody who's actively going around killing trans people, and then the only punishment or recourse in law is a 2,000 rupee fine or a 6 months. Where is this coming from? Who wants those things? So that's sort of the criticism. For instance, healthcare. Certain states have said, okay, we will provide free healthcare for trans people from from OBC, Dalit backgrounds and things like that. But what does that extend to? Is that only for SRS? Is it only for surgery? Is it only for hormones? What happens when a poor trans woman, or for that matter, trans man? We've never talked about trans men yet, because that's the invisible community within the larger visible community that nobody speaks of, right? And that is not in India. Right. And so what happens when, and a lot of trans men are definitely from extremely marginalized Dalit working class families from the south, mostly from rural areas. A lot of them that I know are, right? And then they leave homes because they have absolutely no access to medication, no access to anything where they come from. And it's all doom and gloom, but that's a larger picture that we see. They leave their homes and they come to bigger cities just to access some kind of community and some kind of medication and some kind of support for themselves. So how are we recognizing them in law? How are we safeguarding their interests in law? How are we giving them their rights that are naturally due to them under the Constitution, but obviously is not because of all these layers on top of that?
So, to build on from this, in terms of thinking about it from the political/electoral perspective, more specifically, one of the aspects of the trans movement has been that because of the way the electoral politics works or the electoral system works, there is not that much in terms of the numbers. So either in terms of self-identification due to the structural sort of issues that operate, or more broadly in terms of the dispersed nature of the community. This is not a strength in numbers or an electoral issue in the form of several other issues which sort of attain a scale or attain quote unquote relevance to a very large section of people. So, how has the movement contended with that, and how has the movement sort of negotiated this sort of political space within which decisions are made, particularly around policy? And even the politics of identity are enacted within this space, within this electoral space. So how does that sort of play into the thinking?
To be very, very honest, I don't know. I don't know how this has played out or will play out on an electoral sphere.
Okay.
I don't think it's that, I don't think there is even that recognition even among some of the more progressive political parties. So for us as a movement to come together and demand that thing, I think is going to take a lot more organizing and a lot more education and agitation. And obviously there are other issues before that. There's livelihood, there's survival, there is all those things before we get to that point where we can present a political demand at the time of an election. So what's happening is that some of us are trying in our own little ways to talk to, some of the more friendly politicians. For instance, DMK in Tamil Nadu has always been like that for us. And Kanimuri, who's the MP for one of the MPs from Tamil Nadu, or some of the other MPs, are queer friendly and willing to listen to us. So I think it just has to be that kind of a movement, I suppose. For instance, for the TG bill, we tried to mobilize opposition parties, but that's obviously not an electoral thing. That's just purely, advocacy and policy and activism. How it will translate to policy, I don't know yet, because obviously there are other issues. For instance, the disability movement is trying to figure it out. I think they've got some kind of, success with the CRPD and things like that. The UN mechanisms is sort of the idea of sustainable development goals that the UN is forcing on all member countries is sort of, giving them a little bit of a push. I haven't seen too much of that talk in the trans community. The SDG of the UN also looks at gender rights and gender justice and trans rights and human rights. But I don't see the larger activism of queer, larger activist community of queer people adopting SDG as a platform through which they can fight for our rights. So I think these are the issues. I don't see that electoral push happening yet, largely because there are other issues, more fundamental issues for us.
Yeah. That's fair enough, but what interests me, I think, right at the start of the conversation, also you mentioned this, and you also mentioned that the DMK is one of those parties, right, going back all the way to the TG Welfare Board in 2007, as you mentioned, and also the fact that Tiruchi Silva, a DMK MP, introduced the bill, and other MPs that you mentioned. Is it something to do with the ideology, the way DMK talks about anti-caste ideology? Is that something what prompts response on issues of
Absolutely.
the transgender movement?
The DMK is the direct descendant of the self-right movement, self-respect movement of Periyar. The DMK is the descendant of the anti-Brahmin, anti-caste, movement of the Dravidian politics of the 1920s and 1930s, and then later on. So obviously, it's part of their DNA. For instance, right? Karunanidhi has always been, in fact. The Tamil term for trans woman is Tirunangai, and for trans man is Tirunambi. I don't think there's another equivalent term for a trans man in any of the other Indian languages, right?
No. And I guess for non-Tamil speakers, it's sort of adds a level of respect in the term itself, rather than as an appellation of some sort. So if you could directly translate that for non-Tamil
just to say
listeners.
Earlier, what the community was called the Aravani, which comes from a certain very specific background and was seen as insulting. So, right? And so when the TG Welfare Board of Tamil Nadu government was set up in 2007, 2008, there was a demand that these the names that trans people are known by also gets a bit of a brush up. And that's where Karunanidhi, who was the chief minister at that point of time, came up with these two terms, Tirunambi and Tirunangai. Tiru is a mark of respect. Tiru is like Shri. And Nambi means man or male, and Nangai means woman or female. Right? So it's sort of operating on the respectful or sacred woman, sacred man territory, but it's a lot more acceptable and a lot more open and inclusive than something like Aravani, which obviously only was applied to trans women and didn't even recognize trans men. So Tirunangai, Tirunambi, and then the common umbrella term for transgender was then derived as Tirunar, which I don't think again exists in any of the other Indian languages. There's transgender is the umbrella term around the world for the trans community. Yes. But in India, we had only Hijra, and Hijra was also very specifically thought Hijra is also socio-economic, cultural identity.
Yes.
It's a social and a cultural identity is a certain kind of system. And not all trans women identify as Hijra. For instance, I don't. Right? Therefore, Tirunangai is a much more open term for me than Hijra or Aravani. Similarly, Tirunambi, from what I know from some of the trans men I know in Tamil Nadu, it's a much more it's a much more acceptable word than what there was nothing before, I suppose. Yeah.
Right. So, I think we have learned quite a lot in terms of how to understand this movement, particularly sort of, the points that you bring up around intersectionality in terms of even the ways in which this has played into the strategies and strategies adopted by the movement. But unfortunately, we have to wrap up today as we're nearing time. But it's been a fantastic learning experience. I feel like a lot of the clarity has been achieved in terms of thinking about how NALSA sort of builds into something very significant in terms of reading a huge number of rights into from the Constitution, but then how a lot of it is upturned by the Transgender Bill, which was passed in 2018, and some of the imagination that has driven it and some of the politics that underlie it. So thank you very much, Nadika.
Thank you, Nadika. It was a pleasure discussing this with you. And we end this episode on that note. Thank you all for listening to us. Do stay tuned for more episodes from us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that episode. And if you enjoy listening to content on the IVM Podcast Network, let me tell you about a couple of things that you should check out this week. On IVM Likes, Abbas, Madhuri, Ritika, and Antariksh talk about pop culture that they never tire of and give you some cool recommendations to check out. On Know Your Kanun, Ambar is joined by Arzu, an LLB student, social activist, and environmentalist. They talk about the data protection laws in India. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritasha and Ayushi discuss the importance of health and taking care of oneself in the early stages of adulthood. On Keeping It Queer, Anish Gawande returns to join Naveen and Farhad to discuss adolescent and celebrity crushes. On Football Shitball, Gaurav, Karthik and Siva round up the Premier League weekend and talk about the absolute demolition Bayern Munich inflicted upon Tottenham. On The Origin of Things, Chuck narrates a story about a criminal from Portland, Oregon, whose infamous last words have become the slogan for a famous brand. Thanks, and we hope to see you again soon.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.